For over a decade, the Chinese Communist Party has been butchering thousands of prisoners of conscience for their organs, one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. Doctors schedule an exact day that foreign patients get an organ, whereas in the U.S., it usually takes around 2 years to find a match. Welcome to the Coalition Roundtable. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party has been harvesting the organs of its citizens, prisoners of conscience. This has been a watershed year for the story, thanks in part to those who are joining me today. You did the bloody harvest, you did the slaughter. Why did you make an update?
What we did for Bloody Harvest and Slaughter is we just took the Communist Party of China's statements of volumes at face value. They said 10,000 a year, so we started saying, okay, where does this come from, 10,000 a year? But at some point, we realized, well, I mean, they lie about everything else. Why would they be telling the truth about this? So we decided we'd check that figure as well. It was checkable because we could go to the individual hospitals, and the individual hospitals were telling how many transplants they were doing, either their newsletters or research reports. We had bed counts, we had staff capacities, we had budgets, so we had a lot of different figures to cross-check volumes, and we were able to see whether the 10,000 was real or not. Obviously, it's a lot of work because there's 1,000 hospitals in China doing transplants. 169 of them were eventually registered officially as being allowed to do it, but there was maybe 800 plus others that were also doing it. What we did, obviously with researchers, and a lot of them, is go through all this hospital data to get real volume figures rather than just Communist Party volume figures.
Matt, tell us about the Tianjin Hospital.
I think our challenge all along has been to convince the diehard skeptics. And the original thought behind that was to try to bring this issue into one tangible thing that you can hold in your hand and kind of move around.
So you feel a lot of the information in the bloody harvest and the slaughter was not enough to convince the skeptics? Because it sounds like there's a lot of information out there that was just on the table.
First of all, they don't read the stuff. I mean, so that already makes it very difficult.
Very difficult indeed. Just throw this away now.
These diehard skeptics, they would just not read the stuff and then dismiss it.
I've met with former senior people at major human rights organizations, and they don't know that it's for real, or they don't think it's for real. They're like, oh yeah, that issue. Yeah, but I thought it's like a bit, thrown together. They don't have this idea that it's like totally for real.
So where's that gap coming from?
Because it is such a difficult issue to study. Like if you look at any other major human rights issue in China over the last 20 years or so, for others you've got like some document, for example, looking at orphanages in China that just killed babies, like they let them starve to death in the cold. In that case there was someone who came out, like a doctor who escaped with a duffel bag of documents. And so that makes that one bulletproof.
That was something that happened?
Yeah. I mean, it's totally extraordinary. This was the biggest story, China human rights story. But this one is so crazy. You have to go about it systematically. So you have to whack 3, 4, 5 moles at once, because people always have these different objections to well, how do you know it's not death row? How do you really know it's not death row? How do you really, really, really know it's not death row? Anyway, the Tianjin, the whole point of that was to eliminate objections. Just going by that one hospital, you can be if at least you can show that in this hospital, there's something really screwy going on. First of all, that there's way more transplants than can be explained by the official explanation.
How many transplants?
Then you're already somewhere.
Tianjin, we have figures on Tianjin.
I think it's about 4,000 a year.
Yeah, look, we don't know. We can say how many transplants. You say, look, probably this many. It's completely estimates.
You say you can't know how many transplants this one hospital is doing. How do we know that there are more than 10,000?
Because you can get a really good idea, because here's what you can do. You can be okay, so in 2006 they built a new building with 500 beds, 17 stories. It was funded by the Tianjin government. 2006, the next year, they moved a death row approval to the Supreme People's Court, and they severely dropped the number of people on death row. So the first thing is you show the numbers are really big. And so, for example, you've got 500 beds, and then the occupancy of those beds for kidney and liver transplants is 90%. On their website, they say the average waiting time is 3 to 4 weeks. And so if you say, you've got the beds are occupied to 350 beds are occupied at any one time, and you can also cross-reference it with the surgeons they have there. So they've got a massive surgical team. 60, 70 surgeons. They've got their thick bios. It's not easy to be a transplant doctor. there's a lot of, it's a lot of work. It's a very specialized field of medicine. And so you just put all this together, and the first thing you establish is that the volume is simply huge. So any skeptics out there who are watching this, they have to explain who else is being killed. So if they don't think Falun Gong, this is too crazy, then it's okay, so who?
One thing that Matt said I'd like to follow up on is about waiting times. There are not waiting times for organs, but there are waiting times for beds, because these hospitals are operating at capacity. There aren't enough doctors, there aren't enough beds, there aren't enough hospitals. And there's been this huge building boom of transplant hospitals, and Tianjin's one example of it. And how can they be building all this capital unless they're sure that not only there's a huge supply of organs now, but there's an endless supply of organs into the future? And
that is one of the most striking things, that all this supposed debate has been going on. There's been all this hurly-burly and political play and statements from the Chinese about all their reforms and so forth, and we see it there's nothing reflected in the actual hospital records. There's nothing but construction, nothing but an endless construction, and no signs to be seen within the actual literature of a lack of confidence in the future. Most just creepiest thing is this sense that, we're just going to have organs.
What are the numbers these hospitals are saying they're performing?
I'll give you a fairly simple way of explaining this. It's not a perfectly accurate way. It's a kind of cartoon, but we actually use a more complex method in the update. But there's a number. Give you a number. 146 hospitals who do kidney and liver transplants. That's not even a perfect number, but these are the ones who are sort of
they were registered, approved, yeah.
Registered and approved by the Ministry of Health.
I think there are others, but for the sake of argument.
For the sake a fairly low number. These are just the high volume places, because it makes it simpler. We're not doing hearts, and we're just doing kidneys and livers. Those hospitals tend to have, and you start to see a pattern after looking at this data, and I've been looking at it for quite some time now. You see a pattern of at least 2 to 3 to 3 or 4 transplant teams, actually 20 to 30 transplant beds at least.
Well, they have minimum.
No, we'll get to the minimum requirements in a minute, but we don't even have to use those. You can just see this pattern. And a 20 to 30 day stay, and you tend to see 80 to 100% occupancy rates. What do you pull out of that? Well, one way to say is it possible that the average transplant center in China, ministry approved, is doing 1 transplant a day, just 1?
With all this staff?
Now, with all that staff, 2 to 3 transplants a day, and some of them are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs and not doing anything every day. But let's say they do 1 transplant a day. Well, that gives you a very simple number. 365 times 146, that's 52,000 transplants a year. So we're already at 52,000. Now, the fact is, the Ministry of Health actually demands that they have far more beds than that and a far larger staff than that.
And they actually quota too, isn't it?
Well, yeah, they have quotas, but the key thing is that they're asking for a lot more facilities than that. Well, now, fair enough. Me, David Kilgore, and David Matus are not walking around China with clipboards making sure that the Ministry of Health is getting their money's worth here. We're not doing that, so we can't say that that's right. But if it were true, if these hospitals are following the directives of the Ministry of Health that allow them to get that license, they would have to be doing about 80 to 90,000 transplants per year.
Yeah, that's the minimum.
That's the minimum. And now we haven't even gone into Matt's Tianjin Central Hospital at
military-backed.
4,000 to 5,000. We haven't talked about Beijing 309 military hospital.
The massive hospital.
Yeah, which are way beyond the minimum.
Now we're talking 3,000 to 4,000.
The story of organ harvesting is very much the story of Falun Gong. 1999, it becomes the most controversial hot-button issue in China. What was Falun Gong before 1999, and what happened after?
Before 1999, the Chinese government actually actively promoted Falun Gong as this way to improve health. It's part of the Qigong movement. At that time, it's not just Falun Gong. There are hundreds of other Qigong movements that emerged.
And they were promoting it in state media?
They were promoting it not only in state media, they also give a word to Falun Gong for improving the health, the general state of the population. Falun Gong is more than just the practice that's beneficial to the health. It also has a spiritual side. That is, there are 3 principles: truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And these Falun Gong practitioners are encouraged to use these 3 principles to judge their daily action, their daily decisions. And because of that, they sort of rely on their own conscience and their own judgment they don't follow the communist propaganda anymore.
Look what's happening in China with the Catholic Church. The Communist Party appoints bishops. And with the Buddhism, they've got their own Panchen Lama. And Islam, they have their own imams. But they can't do that with Falun Gong. And because they can't control them by appointing somebody who is the head of Falun Gong, the persecution is the only way out, which is to a certain extent explains the persecution, but also explains their strength, because the Falun Gong cannot be destroyed in that way by appointing somebody the communists decide to appoint as their head, because there is no head.
So you end up with a large group. The official numbers from the Communist Party were 70 to 100 million practitioners. Persecution begins 1999. You end up with a huge body of unnamed, unidentified people in the prisons and the labor camps that everyone else in society has backed away from. And then they become just this huge pool for organs.
Yeah, we've talked to people who've got out of these camps, by the way, and we probably should mention something about that, because we've talked to them on about 15 capitals, and we're absolutely horrified by what they go through in these camps.
This is all small fry. I mean, what happened 6 months later was that they started to systematically build a machine to monetize those people. And this was not clear until this report came out. When all the evidence was put together, it became clear that they built a machine to do transplantations. So the reason the death count is so high now, or is suspected to be so high, is because there's no other plausible source.
How has the Chinese Communist Party been able to maintain its grip on power without using the rule of law?
As Anastasia said, it's totally hostile, harmful to the Chinese people, and not in line with Chinese traditions, but it's very much in line with what communism does. Communism, the leadership of the vanguard of the proletariat, and you can see in the Constitution of China, it's all about the leadership of the Communist Party. But this vanguard of the proletariat, it's a few people. So how are a few people going to rule a large number of people without democratic elections? The way they do that is they create fictitious external enemies, and then they mobilize people behind this false creation of an enemy.
One thing the international community fails to realize is the differences in how the Communist Party structures the country versus in the West. For example, in the United States, it's not as if hospitals are answering directly to the U.S. government. But in China, it's a very different situation with how the CCP has a direct hold on all levels of society.
This extends very much, to the medical system. Like all these major hospitals, they have party cells. Some of them have websites, so you can see they have party meetings. They have a party secretary in these hospitals. A lot of the surgeons that we've been tracking, they double as party officials.
What can other researchers do?
What we need to do is action at the legislative level, such as Israel, Taiwan, Spain have done. Sweden and the United States and so on could pass laws basically barring organ tourism by their citizens to places where they can get trafficked organs. And there's only one place in the world where you can get a trafficked organ on an industrial basis, and that's China.
I would suggest sort of 3 immediate practical targets. End transplant tourism. Secondly, avoid all contact with the Chinese transplant profession. And third, have an independent investigation, governmental or intergovernmental. Those things could be done and will have an impact on what's happening in the future.
That is achievable, too.